for Ukraine?
I hope that they decide to follow President Trump and his team's lead on this, because let's not forget, until President Trump was elected, there was no European leader even working toward peace. In fact, it was scuttled back in 2022 by the EU. And I think quietly in the background, some of these leaders may have been working against the efforts to reach a negotiated peace settlement, encouraging Ukraine and Zelensky to have unrealistic expectations of what this is going to look like.
Some political moments reveal the truth without raising their voice. If you believe democracy deserves honesty, hit subscribe and be part of this conversation. In this segment, we're watching Carla Sands enter an interview prepared with a familiar set of talking points, expecting to repeat them without challenge. But quickly, the interviewer narrows the focus, boxing her in and pushing her to confront a contradiction she keeps avoiding. What starts as a debate about Trump's position on Ukraine and Russia seems straightforward, almost routine, but that's only the surface. The moment that defines this exchange arrives later, when Carla Sands is pressed to reconcile Trump's constant free speech rhetoric with what he has actually done in practice. That single question becomes the pressure point, where her confidence begins to slip, and the argument she carried in starts to break. This isn't about catching someone in a gotcha. It's about the deeper truth. When leaders talk about democracy while acting against it, the mask eventually falls. We'll play the clip from start to finish. Then we'll unpack what's most important, what was said, and what it reveals.
So the new White House national security strategy talks about wanting Ukraine to survive as a viable state, but is being asked to give up territory that Ukraine holds to Russia compatible with being a viable state? I mean, do you think Donald Trump would regard himself as the leader of a viable state if he was asked to give up parts of Texas to Mexico?
But you're actually conflating two things, and this is irrelevant. The fact is that Ukraine has no pathway to win this war. President Trump and his team are attempting to, I believe, de-escalate this war and get this process on a good glide path to find first a ceasefire and then an end to the hostilities. He wants to make sure that Ukraine, and you can read that right in the national security strategy. It's not a long read. It's available publicly. It's a public document. So we can see that President Trump wants Ukraine to remain a sovereign nation, as he hopes the rest of Europe and the UK will remain sovereign nations. At America First Policy Institute, we look at the America First agenda and we say, let's have our allies have a nation first agenda, secure borders, controlled immigration, protection of the rule of law, affordable and abundant energy, protection of your beautiful culture, freedom of speech, if that's part of your constitution, the fact that every nation should put their citizens first, a credible defense, make sure that you can be a viable country and secure. We need that in every one of our allies.
Now, a big theme for Donald Trump is free speech. And in this new White House document, it accuses Europe of censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition. But isn't that exactly what the Trump administration is doing in the United States? I'm thinking of how in September, President Trump celebrated ABC's suspension of the critic Jimmy Kimmel, his show. That was great news for America. And in July, Donald Trump filed that lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch over its reporting of his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. So it's OK for President Trump to limit free speech in the US, but not OK for that to happen in Europe.
Not at all. So free speech is the foundation of our shared, I would say especially UK and US, our shared values. How we got free speech in the United States was from the UK, from hundreds of years ago. And so if we can maintain that, we will be able to have open societies. Once you allow one side to decide what is acceptable speech and not acceptable speech, you have a totalitarian government, because then you will have no free exchange of ideas. And it is happening. Just in Ireland, Enoch Burke, a teacher, because he wouldn't use a student's pronouns. He's been jailed now, and he'll be in prison over Christmas.
Carla Sands, may I politely say that you're evading my question. And the question is
Not
that
at all.
Donald Trump seems to be happy to go to courts to impose limits on free speech in your country and then lecture Europe about imposing limits on free speech over in Europe.
If he sues a network or entity, a newspaper, it's because they have done something that's broken the law. Otherwise, he wouldn't waste his time. He absolutely works to maintain his reputation. He doesn't allow himself to be taken advantage of by these networks. And most of them have been working lockstep with the leftist Democrats in the United States.
But if you believe in free speech, if you believe in that, I think it's the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, that is an unequivocal principle. You stand by that. You don't go to the courts when you don't like what people are saying.
Well, when it's unfair or illegal activity, you do go to the courts. But absolutely, I would say most people who are part of the circle of America First do believe absolutely in free speech. We're really worried about this Digital Services Act that the EU has passed, because I do believe that is a kind of war against the United States. They are working to fine companies like X, Elon Musk, because he allows free speech. They're attempting to censor the speech in the United States of U.S. citizens. That is blatantly not okay. And it is, I believe, it's a gray zone act of war and must end.
So here's where everything crystallizes. Sitting at a desk, watching this unfold, it's almost impossible not to feel that sense of disbelief, because the distance between the narrative being told and the reality we all watched play out is enormous. It makes you wonder whether we're even talking about the same country, the same events, the same definition of free speech. The hypocrisy on display isn't subtle. When members of the Trump orbit lecture Europe and the UK about censorship while ignoring the former president's own record, it becomes something more than irony. It becomes a test of whether the public remembers or whether political memory can simply be overwritten by repetition. Because the facts are plain. Donald Trump publicly criticized protesting when it targeted him. He attacked journalists for doing their jobs. He celebrated when critics were silenced online. And in some cases, people who were legally in the United States and entitled to the same protections found themselves punished and removed for their speech. That is not theoretical. It is lived history. And yet, after all of that, we hear a lecture directed outward, as if Europe is the home of suppression, while the United States, under Trump, was a beacon of openness. That contradiction sits at the center of this entire conversation. Free speech is framed as a principle when convenient, and a weapon when it threatens power. Even now, when Trump praises the First Amendment, it tends to come with an asterisk, usable only when it shields him, dissolvable when it shields others. Supporters like J.D. Vance speak of democracy and expression abroad, but those words fall apart the moment criticism comes too close. Calling for boycotts, retaliation, legal threats, those are tools of control, not confidence. And when we see tech leaders, figures like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, seated beside Trump looking tense instead of collaborative, it raises a quiet question about power. Is this shared governance or pressure disguised as partnership? Blink twice, Mark. We notice the difference. Then there's Carla Sands, returning again and again to defend him. But every time the interviewer forces precision, her answer fractures. One justification becomes another, because defending a contradiction eventually becomes its own contradiction. You can't defend an argument that collapses under its own weight. And here's where the democratic lens matters. Leadership rooted in intimidation and punishment is not leadership rooted in freedom. When someone responds to opposition with control instead of conversation, that's when democracy begins to fade. So I'll leave you with the real question this segment quietly asks. What does free speech mean if it only applies to one side? And who pays the price when power decides whose voice is allowed and whose isn't? Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking critically, and hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and let's keep shaping this conversation together.